Hi, I'm Hannah Lee reporting in Seattle for PepperSpray Productions and the Independent Media Center. On Saturday, February 15th, veterans will be leaving from Seattle and heading towards Bremerton. There, they will be holding an action at the historic ship, the Turner Joy.
Veterans of World War II, the Korean War, the War against Vietnam, and the Gulf War are holding a rally sponsored by Veterans for Peace at the USS Turner Joy, currently moored in Bremerton, Washington, on February 15th, 2003 at 10 a.m. The USS Turner Joy, along with the USS Maddox, was involved in the infamous Gulf of Tonkin incident, which then President Lyndon Johnson used to propel the U.S. into war against Vietnam. The USS Turner Joy, escorting the Maddox, sent messages to Washington indicating the ship was under attack. It was later found that no such attack took place. The messages were blamed on nervous crew members and radar ghost images. But it was the excuse President Johnson and Secretary of Defense McNamara sought. They pressed Congress for a declaration of war. Captured by the moment's hysteria, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The USS Turner Joy represents a great lie, foisted on the American people and the world. An incident that never took place resulted in a terrible war which is now summed up as a mistake. This lie led us into a war resulting in the deaths of 2 to 3 million Southeast Asians. In addition, there are over 58,000 U.S. names on the Vietnam Memorial Wall in Washington, D.C. Besides those who died in Vietnam and who are listed on the memorial wall, veteran groups in the U.S. estimate that more than twice as many GIs came home to commit suicide as died in Vietnam. This means that an astounding 2/3 of American military personnel who died from that war took their own lives. In the American war against Vietnam, GIs who were there knew better than anybody, no matter what the politicians were saying back home, that we didn't belong in Vietnam and weren't doing right. These veterans and their families paid a high price for knowing the truth firsthand. But the Gulf of Tonkin incident is not the only time our country has been tricked into a war of expansion. Some of the veterans going to protest at the USS Turner Joy will be holding signs saying, "Remember the Maine," a reference to the U.S. battleship which exploded and sunk in Havana in 1898. Years later, after several official investigations, including the raising of the ship, nobody has ever proven exactly what happened. The most credible theory is that an accidental fire in a coal bunker ignited the adjacent ammunition magazine. The sinking of the Maine provided the excuse for the U.S. press and president to drag the nation into what Mark Twain described as our first imperialist war. For many years, as a result of that war, the U.S. ruled Cuba, first with a U.S. military governor, later using a series of puppet dictators who by law were selected by the U.S. government. Direct U.S. control over the Cuban government did not end until Fidel Castro marched into Havana. The Spanish-American War, entered as a result of the lies and hype concerning the USS Maine, also allowed the U.S. to take over the Philippines as its new colonial master. U.S. military forces displaced the Spanish, who had previously exploited that island nation, and immediately turned their guns on the Filipino people. A World War II vet who will be at the Veterans Action at the USS Turner Joy maintains that Pearl Harbor should be on the list of lies which got the U.S. into unpopular wars. There is a credible body of evidence that the U.S. government had prior knowledge regarding the impending Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, not the least of which is the banner headline on the front page of the Pearl Harbor Sunday paper 1 week before the attack, which stated,
Japanese may strike over the weekend.
This veteran has a copy of that newspaper. Many World War II veterans feel that Pearl Harbor was a setup, where American sailors were left as floating targets on obsolete ships. There is good reason to believe President Roosevelt knew of the impending attack on the U.S. fleet and allowed it to happen to turn around U.S. public opinion, which until then had been strongly against starting a war with Japan. Finally, the veterans at the USS Turner Joy hope to direct public attention to a recently released book written by respected journalist James Bamford, former investigative producer for ABC World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Bamford has written investigative stories for the New York Times Magazine, the Washington Post Magazine, and other publications. In his latest book, Body of Secrets, Bamford relies on long-suppressed official government records which demonstrate that in 1962, top Pentagon officials hatched a plan, Operation Northwoods, which called for innocent people to be shot on American streets, planes to be hijacked, and phony evidence to be manufactured, all to convince Congress and the American public to support a war against Cuba. Every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and senior Pentagon official Paul Nietzsche supported Operation Northwoods. The plan was given to JFK's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, but was rejected by the Kennedy White House and thus never carried out. With 3 documented instances that actually started wars, and one that would have happened if Kennedy had not stopped it, there is a terrible precedent for duping the public into a war nobody really wants. The veterans who demonstrate at the USS Turner Joy feel that it is their duty to alert the U.S. public to the possibility of another suspicious incident. It is clear that President Bush does not have a mandate for his war against Iraq. Veterans fear that yet another pretext for war will be manufactured to correct this shortcoming. The veterans at the USS Turner Joy, familiar with the true costs of war, will beg the American public to be wary, to watch for such an incident, and to resist the inevitable pull to destruction which it will generate. We have been down this road before, they say, and it is the road to hell. The rally is the first action by the newly formed Western Washington chapter of Veterans for Peace, the newest among 90 chapters nationwide.
The veterans, concerned about an impending war, called a meeting at a community center.
One-time only meeting or the beginning of Vets for Peace, and I'm an Army vet, Vietnam, military intelligence, and got involved in the anti-war movement after I got back from Vietnam. And I got involved in the anti-war movement because of my experiences in Vietnam and the lies that the government was telling us then, and they're very similar to the lies that we're hearing now.
I was thrown in the brig at Fort Lewis for distribution of illicit literature. At the time, I was involved with a group of vets that used to meet down at the shelter half in Tacoma, and we published the Fort Lewis Free Press, and we distributed among the fire guard there, which, by the way, was perfectly legitimate, and we were all arrested.
I'm a World War II DAV, Disabled American Veteran. I'm the son of a disabled American veteran from World War I, who was the son of a disabled vet from Manila Bay, and who was the son of a man that served in the Navy on the Monitor, and his one brother is lost, and the other one was Farragut at Mobile Bay. And so I got a long family tradition of doing what we thought was right to serve on this country.
I was in the U.S. Marine Corps from 93 to 01, and I'm interested in doing anything I can to support any kind of action that we can to support, to ensure that wars are not fought for corporate interests, but are fought only in direct defense of our shores.
Electronics technician, Navy in the Korean War. And up until about 1970, I was sort of down the ideological path. Since then, through reading history and observing and just opening my eyes, I've come to realize that there's so much bullshit out there that I feel like I need to do something. And while I've informally networked with peace groups for 10 or 12 years, this is the first one that I've actually actively joined.
I'm a Persian Gulf veteran. I was in the Marine Corps for 8 years. Got out about 4 years ago. Normally, I would consider myself pretty patriotic and gung ho, but when it comes to this war, I can't find any philosophical or moral reasons we should be involved in this. So.
I was with the Army Infantry in Vietnam, 67 to 69. I went to Iraq 2 summers ago with Voices in the Wilderness to see. I felt like if I'm going to talk about this issue, I need to be able to speak from personal information. And then I think that's the same thing that's important here. We're vets.
I go back to the Vietnam era too. I was a tank driver in Vietnam in '66 and '67, and I got to tell you, my personal feeling about being a human being is it's an evolutionary process. And about 1990, I began to evolve into one of those human beings, and it took a long time.
When I was driving down here, I saw a sign on Westlake. It said, "This makes Nixon look good."
Right, right.
And I was during the Korean thing, it was in basic training, infantry basic, bayonet practice. But I saw the light, where you'd kill! That got me to thinking, gee, I've been going to church and Sunday school, and they say, "Thou shalt not kill." And this kind of bothered me for quite a while. I never went to church after that. I got to thinking about, well, they sent me off with a brass-plated Bible, I guess to protect the heart or something. And, all churches seem to be pretty much in the same boat. They were not preaching out against war. And so anyway, for about 45 years, I never set foot in a church again. The kids weren't brought up in churches, and they turned out real good, no drug problems or anything like that. A couple of years ago, right around Thanksgiving time, I saw a letter in the Ballard News Tribune, not a letter, a column really, by Reverend Rich Lang, who is very active in the anti-war thing here in Seattle. In fact, I just heard him speak at a rally over at Ballard before I came here. But anyway, I did start going to this church, and now I'm a member of that church, and I'm doing everything I can.
Anthony to the front desk, please. Anthony to the front desk. Thank you.
And if we don't stop it, I think we're essentially a fascist country now, and have been for some time. And if we don't stop it, it's just another Hitler.
Say amen to that.
U.S. Navy, 1969-1973. I had a difficult time going into this service in 1969, but I made the choice to go there because I felt myself as a patriot, although I didn't confuse it with nationalism. And I didn't think I understood everything. Well, I still don't, but I went ahead and went in the Navy. I felt that I did so to preserve the values of our country that our country was based upon. And now in 1990, 2000, whatever year it is, I feel betrayed because my country has let me down. I find the idea of preemptive strikes morally repugnant. It was the thing that I went into this service in the first place to keep from happening to people, and now they're getting ready to do it to someone else, and it turns my stomach and makes me want to cry.
That's right.
I was officer of military intelligence, 1968-69. Went to Vietnam, was assigned there to a new program called the Phoenix program, which, speaking about undercutting American values, make a long story short, my job would have been to hire Vietnamese spies to find out which women and kids in villages were working for the NLF, and then the special forces would assassinate them. So I was a volunteer, went into ROTC. I was high point man from my college at summer camp. I liked that stuff. But I couldn't believe that my country was asking me to finger women and children for assassination. So I had to say no at that point and filed for conscientious objector status, expecting it was just a delaying tactic before I went to prison. But after 4 months investigation, they actually granted it. Sent me home, honorable discharge. I always carry away mixed feelings about my experience. One, the horror that my country could do that to me, but also the amazement that they let me out of it as a matter of conscience. At the time, I felt my country had deserted me, and I stopped saying the Pledge of Allegiance, and I stopped took the flags off and I was anti all that. But more recently I've decided maybe I just backed off from my country and I need to reclaim it. And that's what I'm doing here today. Because I think there are values in America worth struggling for, not fighting in wars, but struggling
Peace
for.
is patriotic.
And peace is patriotic.
This is patriotic.
I'm back.
Navy ET, 70-76. I was never in Vietnam, I was in Hawaii. It was there that I got to learn kind of how our country goes about freeing people. And I learned through, what struck me was when I first got there, we were advised by the command to truly not go off base unless it was really necessary. We were advised not to go off base and fraternize with the locals, as they were called, because the locals didn't like us. And I'd been born into the Catholic religion, and so when I was told not to do something, it immediately raised the question as to why. And what I kind of found out was I ended up moving off base and got to realize that there was this long, legitimate grievance with the few remaining Hawaiians that can truly be called Hawaiians, and then the local population at large, with the way they were treated by the military, and the fact that the Hawaiian Islands are by and large one huge military complex when you kind of break down to it. I mean, it's got an interstate there that goes from one base to another base, an interstate in Hawaii, on Oahu. But anyways, that was part of my education, where in learning what our country had done and then kind of learning about people in our country that had gone before us, Mark Twain being the one that always jumps out to me. I began to call myself an anti-imperialist, and began, more importantly, to call myself an internationalist. And I'm probably definitely the minority in this group where I don't agree with the thing that peace is patriotic, because I think patriotism forces you to pull borders around you and walls around your country. And what it's going to take to make peace in this world is for us to get over borders, to get over countries, and to realize that we're all people. I mean, I kind of agree with yours. Is, you know, human life is the most important thing to me. Having kids and now having grandkids has really, you know, said that life is sacred, and we're not going to have any kind of a future for us, for them, for anyone, if we still cling to these petty, archaic, old kinds of definitions of who we are and what we are.
I was in the regular Army 62 to 65 and 2 years in Germany in the 3rd Infantry Division, which I see now on the TV. Looks like they're going to be launching from Kuwait. But I was not a happy camper in the Army, but I didn't go over the side until 1970 with the triple events of Kent State, Jackson State, and of course prior to that the invasion of Cambodia.
I'm one of those jarheads that really never saw combat. I suppose the Vietnam era vet covers it, but it's much more shallow than that, because I was a ski instructor in the mountain warfare troops for 3 of the 6 years I was in. You know, I just can't help resonating with what Gary said, and Mark said, and Marty said. You know, those 3 things have coalesced me into an anti-war, you know, we are. I just sum it up by saying I am not I never have been an asset of corporate America.
I'm the son of a Marine who fought in Korea at the Chosin Reservoir. I have a son who just completed 4 years in the Coast Guard, another son who's on active duty in the Navy on the Enterprise, and I'm an ex-Marine myself who served during the Vietnam era war. But I was not led there out of any kind of right-wing kind of patriotic sense of mission. More so it was a nudge from the judge, and was presented with what His Honor called a choice. And I took what I thought was the lesser of 2 evils, and semper fi, do or die. Just briefly, what kind of shaped, I think, a part of the way I see the world is as a 9-year-old schoolboy, I stood on Lemon Avenue in Dallas, Texas, November 22nd, 1963, and I waved to President Kennedy less than 5 minutes before the assassination. I was attending parochial school, and it was our parish priest who performed the last rites on him. It happened less than 2 miles. I stood from the grassy knoll. And that had an impact. And 11 years later, I'm in the uniform of United States Marine watching Richard Nixon resign in shame all the while claiming he was no crook. And since then, I have learned to distrust everything that comes from 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And I really see a long line of abuses that have spent the lives of many great young Americans and the lives of many innocent people all over this world for the sake of corporate greed and oil. And my concern is that somehow we can raise a voice and accomplish something that awakens people to behave with a sense of compassion and respect for life.
Talking to a larger audience.
The Turner Joy was one of the U.S. destroyers involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It was there with the destroyer Maddox in the middle of the night when they were supposedly attacked by North Vietnamese gunboats. And there were 2 incidents, I believe, one night and one the next. And President Johnson used those as the triggering incident to get the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which gave him war powers to lead the rest of the Vietnam engagement. It later turns out that those incidents were, one was grossly exaggerated and the other one probably didn't happen. And the source for that is Robert McNamara. So, I think it's a great symbol of the suspicion with which the American people needs to view triggers right now that are coming out of the White House. We've got significant opposition to this war. We've got a United Nations that's not going along with it. We've got NATO that's not going along with it. And they've already given almost all the intelligence out they're going to give, and they're out of persuasive weapons. The next logical thing would be an incident.
To manufacture something.
To manufacture something.
Right.
I think the Turner Joy has a crucial message at a crucial time.
And he just mentioned the Maine in Havana, same time of thing, it was, so we're being sucked in again.
There's one more thing I want to bring up too. Dean Rusk was there when that was unfolding in early August 1964. Dean Rusk said that the scene for that happening, for that attack taking place against Turner Joy and the Maddox, was written up weeks before by the White House. That's what Dean Rusk said.
I'd also like to add, now I had the pleasure of working with Frank Church before his death. And as you know, Frank Church was very much involved at this time as the senator from Idaho and on the committee, Foreign Relations Committee.
All of the targets that the Bush would
Frank
like to
Church
undo.
told me personally, in the presence of at least 60 other college students, because I went to school at Boise State University where he spoke, he told us personally that the incident never occurred, that the United States government knew that the incident never occurred. He also pointed out that Vo Nguyen Giap in his memoirs confirmed the statement that was made by Robert McNamara. So I mean, this is a classic example of perfidy, classic example of concoction, a classic example, as you say, of a trigger that was merely a contrivance, was manufactured. And that is, you can take that to the bank.
Right.
There's a place to do it in. I was called by one of the police lieutenants in Bremerton after we'd done our recon and said, I'd like you to know that you need a park permit if you're going to do what you're going to do. And I said, how do you know what we're going to do? He said, well, the Coast Guard told me. So I don't know where that came from. But I called the Parks Department, and yeah, for $12, we got a permit to use it on the 15th if we want to.
The veterans sent out a reconnaissance team to Bremerton to check out the possibility of an action at the Turner Joy.
We're going to do a recon on the Turner Joy at 12 noon today.
American military veterans, older now and possibly wiser, have learned a lesson paid for in blood. It is a lesson they refuse to keep to themselves. On February 15th, veterans at the USS Turner Joy will be begging the American public and the world to turn away from war. They will be warning the public to be alert for a false provocation and begging the country to stand up for a dream rather than fall for a lie.
I'd like to do is just see what the situation is and go back and plan something and
Well, I agree.
notify the local press, get Seattle folks set up,
I agree.
get our own photographers ready and some better signs.
I agree.
And be here with something that's visible a long way away so we can take photographs
agree.
for the press
I
and send
agree.
them out and stuff
I
like
agree.
that.
I agree.
There's trouble with her here.
Okay. Okay, there they are. What's the matter, Captain?
Where I want it to be.
Roger, we're being attacked by a 24-foot torpedo boat. Abandoned ship! Abandoned ship!
This is a petition to start a Pacific Northwest chapter of the Veterans for Peace Incorporated. We need 10 signatures of guys who can verify their participation in the military through their DD-214 forms. I'm going to sign my name now. I'm number 4. So we just need 6 more after me. I'm signing this petition, interestingly enough, on the bridge of the USS Destroyer Turner Joy. Turner Joy was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident that began the Vietnam War. I'm hoping this will be a step to prevent the invasion of Iraq.
For PepperSpray Productions and the Seattle Independent Media Center, this is Hannah Lee.